is Let's Talk Energy, your go-to podcast for smart energy insights. I'm your host, Noah Brenner, and each week we're bringing you an inside look at the dynamics shaping global energy markets through in-depth conversations with our own Rystad Energy experts, as well as some special guests. In today's episode, we dust off our crystal ball and look at different ways the energy system could evolve over the next 50 years or more. Rystad Energy has just published its latest global energy scenarios, a comprehensive look at what our energy world and climate might look like under a set of potential pathways ranging from a rapid and ambitious energy transition to a slower shift where our reliance on fossil fuels is larger for longer. This year's report is titled The Next Era of Energy. It highlights some of the rapid and consequential shifts that we are already seeing in the energy system and which countries are moving more quickly or more slowly than their neighbors are. The report comes just ahead of the much-anticipated COP30 conference in Brazil, where nations will present their new and more ambitious climate targets against a backdrop of increasing opposition to transition policies, particularly in the United States. Now, what can these scenarios tell us about our energy future and what that future might look like and what signposts we should be focusing on to recognize the direction of travel? What trends are most important when it comes to shaping the global energy mix and which countries are leading those trends? Finally, how long could the evolution toward this new era take? And what does that mean for the energy mix during that process? I'm joined today from Oslo by John Hansen, Head of Energy Systems, and Lars Nitter Havro, Head of Energy Macro at Rystad Energy, to talk about how the world's energy system is evolving and what it might look like in the future. John, Lars, welcome to the program.
Good to see you, Noah.
Thanks for having us.
Well, let's talk energy. Lars, let's start with the title of this year's report. It's The Next Energy Era. And so why did you choose that title? And what are some of the defining features that you see evolving in this next era?
We call it the next energy era because of a twofold reason. Firstly, because we're entering kind of a new era now where we're not in the same world as we were last year, right? Things are changing geopolitically. There is more turbulence in the policy side of things. Economically, things are also quite turbulent. And so that is partly the next era story. But it also launches into this structural shift that we're witnessing more long-term with a fourth structural shift, as I refer to it as, with how the world powers itself from basically going from molecules over to electrons. So just as we've moved from predominantly using biomass back in the 1800s to using more coal as that came online, we didn't necessarily stop using biomass on the whole. Like I still burn wood in my fireplace and home. But of course, also we started to use much more coal relatively than we used biomass. Similarly, we went from coal to oil and gas, right? So then we shifted again to using much more oil and gas today than we use coal to power transportation, was revolutionized and everything. And now we're, of course, kind of crossing the line into this next energy era, which is largely powered by electrification and clean electrons down the line.
John, I want to come over to you. I mean, often the energy transition and the scenarios around how it might unfold are fairly tightly focused on the climate implications of our energy choices. But this report in particular points out that the ramifications of the transition are much broader, perhaps, than just climate or even necessarily maybe just narrowly energy and the way that we're meeting certain demands. So tell me more about the impact of this shift.
The role of the energy system is kind of being redefined at the moment. So when we think about the energy system, we think about how the energy system is delivering on three or perhaps even four dimensions. We talk about reliable, affordable, sustainable energy. But now, also more recently, we have added sort of a competitiveness angle into this, the so-called sovereign energy. Since we have all these multiple angles and multiple dimensions defining the energy system, it's very important when we design scenarios that we think of all these dimensions and what it really means for the economy and for the society going forward. So when we think about this, we think about it as an energy pyramid, so a hierarchy of needs where you have the most basic needs at the bottom of this pyramid. And that's typically where you find reliable, affordable energy. And I think what Lars is talking about is a shift that has happened in maybe the recent 2 years, where perhaps now sustainability or the climate angle has becoming sort of the fourth on top of this pyramid, and it's sort of like a pecking order. And I think this is important because we're coming into an age then where we need to think about what a climate pragmatism type of scenario will look like. So perhaps in the last years we have discussed a lot on what a very ambitious climate scenarios would look like, and there are certain choices that we may have to make today in order to achieve that type of scenario. However, the sort of, call it, the geopolitical circumstances or the reality today are shifting a little bit away from what is required to achieve that type of scenario. So I think it's important when we talk about the next energy era to think of how that, call it, the next energy transition era discussion kind of is also changing. So I think that's very fascinating, and it's very important to recognize.
What I'd like to understand is what's different between Rystad's scenario work and other scenarios that our listeners might hear about out there, whether it's those from Shell or those from the International Energy Agency. What is it that is different about our work?
We have sort of chosen a slightly different path than most of these for two reasons. The first reason is and difference is the granularity of the data and the modeling that we're doing. So in our energy scenario model, we're actually building on Rystad Energy's asset level types of insights. So Rystad has more than 300,000 assets in our databases, which our clients can access. And then what we're doing is that we're designing these scenarios together with all the leading experts in the company, so the scenarios can reflect the best insight that the entire company have on a certain dimension. And then the energy scenario model will look at the energy, the emissions, and all the assumptions going into this for more than 217 countries. We look across more than 70 different energy carriers. So think of hydrogen and different types of oil products, etc. And we look across more than 60 different sectors. So that's the first reason, like the granularity of the data. The second reason is slightly more technical. Our model starts with what we call useful energy. It's the joy and benefit that we get out of the energy system. So think of all the cold beer and hot showers, and when you move a car from A to B, like these types of things that we need energy for, that's the useful energy. And this is very different than primary energy. So primary energy is all the energy that we push into the energy system. So all the oil and gas that we extract, the coal, etc. And the reason for this being very different is that there's a lot of losses in the way we produce electricity and heat. And there's also a lot of losses happening in these end user appliances. So for example, if you move from an ICE vehicle, so a traditional car, to an electric car, you'll have something like a 70% enhancement in the energy efficiency. So we have to take these things into account. And what we then actually find, which is super interesting, is that we see useful energy continuing to grow throughout the forecasting period that we're looking at. However, the primary energy, depending a little bit on the scenario, will peak around 2035 in the 1.9 degree scenario, just to give you an example.
Talk to me about some of these other scenarios, either the NDC scenario, but also this decarbonization index that are both new this year.
The easy answer to that this year is 25%. 25% is an easy number to remember, but what does it mean? So we created a decarbonization index where we looked at what we call the 3 tasks of the energy transition: to clean up and grow the power sector, number 2, electrification, and number 3, cleaning up residual emissions. And basically what we see then is that if you look at how well we have progressed on this from the energy point of view, we have of useful energy, which I talked about earlier. We have an energy system today where 25% of all the services that we can get from non-fossil fuel sources. So also means, of course, that if we pull out all the energy, fossil energy today, we will lose 75% of all the energy service that we get. So that's not a good scenario, but it creates sort of an opportunity to look also how different countries are progressing and how and why they are progressing. The other side of this is, of course, what we call the NDCs. So what's the NDC? The NDC stands for nationally determined contributions, which is basically the cornerstone, I would say, of the Paris Agreement. The beauty of the Paris Agreement is then that every 5 years, the countries have to resubmit these climate targets. And that's actually where we are now in 2025. In just a few days, the COP30 is starting in Belém in Brazil. And all the signatories of the Paris Agreement have to update these NDCs. And what we wanted to do was to look at all these NDCs and see sort of like, where are those climate pledges currently taking us? What type of degree scenario could that be aligned with? And not least, sort of what does the energy system look like in that type of scenario? How much oil do you need in 2035 and so on? That's what we have created, and which is we write about in the report. And the key finding there, which I think is very interesting, is that from today to 2035, the NDCs that are currently submitted to the UNFCCC or the Paris Agreement can give something like a 25% reduction in global CO2 emissions. That's, of course, more of a reduction than what we are seeing in our house view. So there's an implementation gap. So countries are not really delivering yet on what they are sort of saying they want to do. And then there's also an ambition gap. And that ambition gap is basically relative to the lower bound of the Paris Agreement, the lower range, and that's the 1.5 degree scenario, which will require actually a 60% type of decrease only to 2035.
What are the other, I guess, kind of 3 core scenarios maybe that we look at in the report, and sort of what are some of the assumptions around what would be needed to create those types of futures?
The first scenario is what we call the climate first scenario. That's a 1.6 degree scenario compliant with the carbon budgets of around 650 gigatons from today to or 2020 to you reach net zero. What is interesting with that scenario is not necessarily the carbon constraints that it's coming with, but also some of the implicit assumptions when it comes to the geopolitical circumstances that they can actually unfold. So this, of course, requires a very, very rapid transition to this next energy era that we have been talking about. That will require some coordinated efforts globally, and it will all sort of build on a geopolitical system which is stable and where people are working and governments are working together in order to achieve outcomes. And what we like to call as a deep decarbonization, where we also tackle emissions in these hard-to-abate sectors.
The next one, I think, is climate pragmatism. Lars, did you want to grab that one?
One of the things that we're seeing globally unfolding now is sort of what I mentioned, kind of the first half of this next energy era, where we're looking at more of a non-linear transition unfolding. There are unexpected turns and twists, and sometimes things go much faster, sometimes things go much slower. And one of the things that we've found now through this house view process is that this 1.9 degree carbon budget constraints in our model actually maps pretty well to our house view emissions. So when we stack up our bottom-up approach across all of the verticals that we cover and look at the emissions from that, it maps pretty well to what we're seeing unfold globally at the moment in our kind of house view case, right? So that effectively means that from today over the next 10 years or so to 2035, if the world continues to unfold as we think it will, with current acceleration of solar and EVs and all of these things that are going much faster than most people thought initially, then we will actually end up seeing a trajectory near term that is underneath 2 degrees.
John, let's come back to you. We do look at potential scenarios where the transition does slow down, where oil and gas is more resilient. So talk to us about that kind of that top scenario, maybe.
Yeah, so that's what we call the fossil first scenarios. That's compliant with a 2.2 degrees of global warming. And of course, that's a scenario where the Paris Agreement is not reached. We see fossil fuels being much more resilient, the much slower transition also in the power sector, which is now moving quite quickly. So there are certain elements that needs to happen in order for that type of scenario to unfold. I think what is interesting with the climate pragmatism scenario, which Lars talked about, is also a little bit to understand when it's reaching net zero. So that type of scenario will reach net zero around 2085, while a climate ambition scenario will probably be closer to 2055 to 2060, while this fossil first scenario actually reaches net zero after 2100, so quite far out in time in order to meet those types of assumptions.
Lars, I want to come back to you to touch on something that you mentioned in your previous response. There's a line in the report that says, it really struck me. It says, what we see now, or what we now see as dead, are dystopian climate scenarios, which, again, I don't feel like we necessarily hear in the everyday discussion around climate. And so I think it's really important. I think it often feels like the world is regressing, but the report seems to be painting a picture that is less dire, but albeit with some obvious challenges. So could you just unpack that for me, and why it is that we think that perhaps some of the worst impacts of climate are perhaps some of the most least likely outcomes in our scenarios?
Really something that shows more like where we are at the moment. And I think it boils back to some of the key things that we underline in the report, which is that, yes, there are some kind of short-term volatilities unfolding here, particularly with the US policy pivots, for instance. However, even though we tend to maybe be a bit Western-centric in our worldview, being where we are today, we definitely are seeing something unfolding on a much bigger, longer time scale than these short 4-year cycles, for instance.
If you just look at the macroeconomics happening now over the next, say, 25 plus years, right? Population growth is going to slow down. So the last, say, 15 years, global population has increased by 1.1%. But in the next sort of 15, 20 years time frame, it's going to slow down to 0.7%. So a slower population growth. Also, the global macro economy is shifting towards something that's much more, call it mature. So it's a much more developed type of macro economy. And what is typically happening when countries are going through these types of economic development is that they require very energy intensive types of goods in the beginning, so the cement and the steel, while some of these now at least not growing as much as they have done in the past. So that's also a little bit of the background here. In addition to what Lars is pointing out, that we see green electrons or electricity becoming increasingly cost competitive. If you take all the emissions happening in the power sector, that's about 15 gigatons of CO2 emissions out of the almost 40 gigatons that is emitted globally every year. So it's sort of like, if you can tackle the power sector, then you can also address 40% of the emissions. So I think there's some good moving pieces here, which is at least excluding some of these scenarios where we reach a very, very high degree of global warming and that's a good news for us.
You've talked a little bit about kind of the task 1, 2, and 3, sort of what went into some of that analysis. But let's talk about some of the results. I mean, I was surprised that some of these countries that perhaps aren't necessarily known for climate ambition are higher up the list than I might have thought, and China is perhaps a little bit lower in the list. But obviously, we've got some Nordics at the top of that. Brazil, I was surprised, very highly ranked. China just outside the top 10, but certainly there. What are some of the common threads, maybe, that you see running through those countries that have placed well on that decarbonization index?
The decarbonization index today is perhaps more a reflection of call it the natural resources in a given country than sort of how ambitious it has been or successful it has been to drive sort of aggressive climate policies. So that's, I think, is a very important point. So the countries that we see on the top of this list, some of the Nordic countries, Brazil, have had an energy system, or a power system to be exact, that has been very much built on hydropower, which was something that was economically viable to do and has been that for a long time. And Norway is a good example, building out hydropower some 100 years ago, right? But what is also on that list are countries which have a large nuclear fleet. So France is a good example of that. But in order to sort of make it all the way to the top of the list, you also need to be good on electrification. And that's where you find some of these Nordic countries, which basically never used gas in buildings and industry, at least not at a very significant scale, as you can see, for example, in continental Europe.
Lars, I wanted to come to you here. You're calling these groups of countries pathfinders, scalers, and accelerators. And so what exactly do you mean by those terms, and which countries maybe fit into some of those buckets?
And in particular, one of the countries that I think is perhaps most interesting is like Pakistan. They started surpassing that 1% of installed base being solar 6 years ago. China, they spent around 14 years or so going to 30%, I think, of their installed power generation capacity being solar. So now it's around 30. And it took them, since they passed 1%, it took them 14 years to get there. We've seen similar growth rates now unfolding, as I mentioned, Chile, for instance, in Brazil, and we're seeing them happen in other countries as well.
John, let's start with you. I mean, was this surprising to you when you put this list together, or perhaps maybe just underappreciated globally?
Most of the countries here, and perhaps all of the countries, are fossil fuel import-dependent countries, where energy security has been a very important driver. I think South Korea and Japan are some very good examples of that, where they basically have to, these countries have to import all the fossil fuels they have. So to have an energy system based on electrons could perhaps lead to some diversification gains. The China story is kind of well known now, at least it's been talked about quite a lot. China actually moved, if you look at the electrons part of useful energy, and also take out the feedstock here, which is quite important because feedstock is energy use, but it's not for energy purposes. So I think we should take that out. Then you actually can see that over the last, say, 20 years, China has moved from having 25% now up to almost 45% of their energy, their useful energy, being supplied by electrons. What is interesting, though, is that if you look at the global average of electricity, it's around 33%. If you look at all the countries, you actually see that 75% of all the countries has an electrification rate lower than the global average. So perhaps electrification hasn't progressed as far as we maybe would have hoped on a global scale. But that is now changing with all the innovation happening.
Lars, I want to bring you in here because does this overlay, this Pathfinder, Scalers, Accelerators overlay work when we're looking at something like EV adoption or another kind of measure of electrification?
certainly heat pumps, I think, applies as well. But for EVs in particular, we have done similar analyses looking at kind of the front-running countries, the pathfinders, Norway being, of course, the main one. You mostly only see EVs here in Oslo these days. Even the buses and the trucks are turning electric. And so that is now that we see 95% of all passenger vehicle sales in Norway are electric now. But it took us a while to get here. We didn't start really 10 years ago or so, I think. So we really kind of broke ground on how to develop this industry, introduce charging points. We really worked a lot with some of the foremost companies to develop some new solutions for things. And then, of course, again, China came in and really scaled battery manufacturing. They scaled new ways of producing cars. There are, of course, great companies as well that have done this in the West, and of course, they have contributed to some of the automakers that we have here at home, for instance, in Europe or in America. But China has, of course, kind of cornered the battery market on the back of this and really accelerated their sales now of EVs as well, which is, I think, already moving towards, 30-40% or so out of all sales EV-wise in China. And we're seeing now this similar dynamic unfolding again in these emerging countries. Or emerging economies, like Thailand, for instance, which I think it's taken them 4 years to go from passing 1% threshold of EV sales compared to all ICE sales in the passenger class to going to 20%. So in Thailand now, every fifth car sold is electric, and just about 3 or 4 years ago, it was 1 in every 100 or so.
That brings us to task 3, which is those hard to decarbonize sectors that require solutions that maybe are not as mature, certainly are not as mature, I guess, as electric vehicles or solar PV, things like hydrogen, biofuels, carbon capture. And so I guess, is this an example of where the transition is becoming more difficult to advance? As you pointed out earlier in the program, maybe those 1.5 degree scenarios don't look quite as in reach as perhaps they might have, say 3 years ago. Is this something that might drive some of that difficulty, I guess?
If we look back to the Decarbonization Index and how we solve that third task, where countries have really progressed has been on the biofuel side of things. So you have some countries there where you have biofuel that's being used, for example, in some of their industries. So in the pulp and paper industry, you used a lot of biofuels. Brazil is a good example where biofuels is also playing a role in the road transport sector. But then moving forward, that part of the index will have to include more advanced types of fuels, including hydrogen, some e-fuels, etc. And of course, to tackle hard-to-abate sectors, emissions will be increasingly important. So if you move forward now with a kind of a rapid decarbonization of the power sector, and perhaps also on electrification of road transport, etc., you are sort of, call it a little bit stuck with some of these hard-to-abate sectors being iron and steel, cement, maybe shipping, aviation, and a few others. And what we're seeing is that when you move to 2050, emissions from these sectors in a 1.9 or a climate pragmatism scenario will suddenly be half of all the CO2 emissions that you're left with in 2050, right? So I think it's important to recognize that the attention towards these emissions will increase also in this time frame that we have here.
The last mile of the transition has kind of always been touted as the longest, the most expensive one, but the kind of 90% first 90% are quicker at least, and more affordable, whereas the 10-20% or so where we really require to address these hard-to-abate solutions, these hard-to-abate sectors with solutions, I should say, are definitely more challenging. We are seeing progress, though, in these key technologies like hydrogen, even though hydrogen has been receiving a lot of flack over the past couple of years. There is actually now, I think, something that we're moving from a lot of announcements being made to kind of the cowboys being shaken out a little bit of the industry. So that's certainly what I'm hearing more in the conferences that I'm going to. And Now they're kind of more established players involved in these industries that know how to handle big EPC projects and that have executed gas projects in the past, for instance, that are really moving forward with these projects. And we're definitely seeing materialization of capacity. It's just not as big as we thought back in 2022, for instance. The similar story is also for CCS, for instance, where, yes, we have seen decreased announcements for projects, for sure, but we've also seen a lot of projects actually break ground, pass FIDs, and actually start to capture as well these days. So things are moving forward here. It's just going to take longer, I think.
That's a perfect segue to talk about timelines here. As you said, certain parts of this might move very quickly, certain changes might move much more slowly. And so, what do the timelines look like here? And what I really want to understand is, I guess, what does fossil fuel demand perhaps look like in the meantime as we do see these shifts emerge over the coming decades?
To refer back to our forecast, which is the house view. So it's different than the scenario, which is an alternative future. So a forecast is basically what we see will happen, or we think is most likely to happen moving forward. And in this forecast period of the house view, which is the next 10 to 15 years, we see oil and gas reaching some plateau levels in the late 2030s. But it still will be a dominant part of the energy system in this time frame. I think coal, on the other hand, I think is very likely to be at its peak, maybe even this year, and we'll see decline certainly in the power sector, where 60% of all coal use is being used today. So the more resilient part of oil demand is found in the petrochemical sector, is found in aviation and in the shipping sector, and like Lars talked about, the road transport sector, particularly in the car segment, is perhaps where we can see more movements. But for gas, it's different, right? You use gas also in the power sector, where gas had to compete with very cheap renewables coming in with very low marginal costs. So that's a little bit of a different story when you talk about gas, and that comes back to really, can you scale solar and wind fast enough to meet that additional very high demand of electricity, which we are seeing moving forward? Or do you actually need gas to come in order to make sure that we're actually delivering on the demand that we're seeing coming from the consumers?
So that transition of energy forms looks different based on the type of energy. Maybe we see a more rapid transition away from coal, a slower transition, certainly when it comes to oil and gas, perhaps an open question in terms of how we think about addition and transition, looking over, maybe 15 years and then looking out decade by decade out to 2100. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining. Congratulations on getting the report out. I know it's been a labor of love for many, many weeks for both of you. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Noah.
Thank you.
Let's recap. The energy system is entering a new era, one that's going to be defined by growing amounts of renewable power generation as these sources and the associated batteries and grid developments take on a larger and larger share of global energy investments. A diverse set of countries have emerged as transition leaders, including European nations that have rapidly decarbonized their power sectors, and a number of non-OECD countries in Asia that are rapidly electrifying their economies as energy becomes increasingly linked to industrial and foreign policy goals. Rystad Energy scenarios indicate that the world is likely to limit warming to the point that we avoid the worst impacts of climate change. But the pathways to reach net zero by 2050 are also looking increasingly challenged. Thanks for listening to Let's Talk Energy. This podcast is a Rystad Energy production, produced by Laura Rodriguez-Skaug and Boda Og. Check out the show notes for further analysis on the topics that we've discussed in today's episode, and connect with us on social media. We're at Rystad Energy on all your major platforms. While you're there, click that like button or subscribe and leave us a review. You can also keep up to date with us on our website. If you'd like to send us questions or maybe a recommendation for a topic to tackle in the next episode, email us directly. It's podcast@rystadenergy.com. And most importantly, don't forget to join us next week for more Let's Talk Energy.